I'm John Sandbach. I'm here today with the astrologer, Ellie Adams. We are going to talk about retrogrades on my Circular Temple podcast. And Ellie, take it away.
Retrograde planets, they spiritualize, they turn the energy inward. They do kind of, and I'm kind of careful when I say this, they do kind of introvert the energy. But I'm careful when I say that because then people start thinking like Myers-Briggs, and and
Right.
that's not how I mean it necessarily. But the energy of the planet does go inward.
Yes.
It's funneled inward. Yeah, that is how I think about them most of all.
Yes.
In general. What about you?
Yes. That certainly makes sense. And everything you said is in line with Mark Jones' ideas about retrograde. I think, too, that we live in such a material-oriented world, a world that's so into surfaces, that retrograde can be difficult for a lot of people because they don't want their energy turned inward. That's
no, and we also live in a world where if your energy does turn inward, you don't really fit.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which can be very difficult and isolating.
Yeah, everybody thinks that being an extrovert is really good, that that's a really good thing, and that somehow being an introvert is not a good thing. But I don't think either one is better than the other.
No, I don't either. They both have their strengths. They both have their challenges.
Right. I think it's interesting. The planet that is least likely to be retrograde is Venus.
Yes.
And I think one thing I've always thought about that is because Venus, love is really meant to be shared with others.
Yes.
But I think a lot of times that when Venus is retrograde, it has to do with learning to love yourself.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that because especially because when you look at Venus, right? Venus rules both Libra and rules Taurus. And the direct motion is much more a loving others kind of thing, right? A Libra sort of thing.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Whereas when it's retrograde, there really is a Taurus feeling to it.
Yes.
And Taurus is about self-worth, self-value, values in general, but self-worth,
Right. Right.
Absolutely. That's so critical for people that have Venus retrograde.
Yes. Yeah, that really makes sense. And also with Taurus, one thing I think about Taurus too is that so much of our judgments about self-worth tend to come from the outside world, whereas when you can clear all those away, then you can feel yourself and feel what you're really like on your own without all that social monitoring sort of stuff,
Yeah.
And that's the highest level of Taurus, when you can really see your own worth apart from everybody else's input into it.
Yes. Yes. I agree. Yes, absolutely. Well, then there's Mercury retrograde. And Mercury retrograde, that's the one that everybody, it happens in, transit-wise, and everybody freaks the fuck out like they don't know. And I mean, yeah, communications can get a little wonky. Yeah, you might have somebody coming back from the dead, like a ex-partner. That can happen, coming back like a zombie. Same thing can happen when Venus goes retrograde, transit-wise too. It can. But more than that, I mean, more than those sorts of stereotypical things, when I think of Mercury retrograde, I think of you've got a bunch of puzzle pieces on the ground, and you're looking at the pieces individually, but there can be trouble seeing how it's finished.
Yes.
You can see all of the pieces, and it's not that Mercury retrograde doesn't see how to put them together, but it's like there are so many on the floor, like a 1,000 piece puzzle, right? And sometimes I feel like they don't know where to start, or it's, you know what I mean? Like there's just a lot of noise in that regard. So it can be difficult to see the full completed thing. For Mercury retrograde people, it's usually very important that they figure out what noise to tune out so they can see the big picture with things, the bigger finished product, if you will.
Yes. And when it comes to tuning out that noise, there's the outer noise, there's so much of that.
Yes.
Around us all the time, thoughts, ideas, information, advertising, news, blah, blah, blah. And there's also inner noise.
Yes.
Like
and
things we're telling ourselves,
Absolutely. And sometimes that's the noisiest fucking noise of all.
Oh, man, that can be horrible.
Yes. Yes. But I have found that that's kind of, and the intuition thing. The intuition thing is so important for Mercury retrograde people. Trusting that.
Yes.
Trusting that, like, when they're looking at this 1,000-piece puzzle on the ground, right?
Yeah.
Trusting their intuition of where to start and where to go. And sometimes all that noise, whether that be internal, external, what have you, can fuck up that intuition,
Exactly.
Tuning it out, trusting themselves in that sense.
Yeah. I'm feeling more and more the older I get that what communication most needs is intuition.
Yeah.
It really needs that. Like when you and I talk, I can feel your energy. I can intuit like where you're at, like I feel like a psychic connection with you. I think that's what makes communication clear. When communication gets unclear is when people are psychically off, I think.
And they're not picking up even just the subtleties that they kind of give off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 I've definitely known people that I didn't really feel like they were kind of unpredictable though, as it was. But there were people that I knew where it was kind of like, I don't really know where they're at the moment.
Right.
And I actually felt like they were blocking me from knowing this too. Like,
oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh,
like
yeah.
they didn't want me to know. It's like I'm thinking, okay, I'm just gonna go over here for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, the intuition, super important for Mercury retrograde people. Super important.
That really makes sense. So I would think that would also imply that when Mercury is retrograde, it's a time when all of us can more easily work on developing our intuition.
Yes, it is. As long as we can tune out all of the noise.
Or
some of it. You know what I mean? Like, yes.
Oh yeah.
I agree with that. When Mercury goes retrograde, it's definitely a good time to work on your intuitive skills, to really zone in on those, hone in on those. Things do tend to be noisier, though, externally for sure. But yeah, if you can tune that out and just kind of focus on that, it could be a great time for that.
Yes. Yes.
Jupiter retrograde can see like they tend to be able to see the big picture, right? They can see things in a large scale way. They can see that puzzle on the ground. They know how it's complete. They're starting from that completion point. They have issues breaking things down piece by piece. That can be difficult for them, like the detail thing, kind of. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The detail.
Can I say something there?
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you talked about the noise.
Yeah.
So it seems like when you say detail, what's needed is to observe significant details.
Yeah.
Rather than just noise details.
Yeah. No. Because Jupiter retrograde actually, I find, has its own kind of noise. It's more like belief focused noise.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like mundane noise.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this is what you should believe. This is that kind of shit, that kind of noise.
Yeah.
So it does have
how things should be.
Yes, how they should. Yeah, what one should find true, what one should believe. There can be what they should understand. There could be noise in that regard. with them. But yes, specific details of like why that puzzle was complete in the first place, like what brought all those pieces together that they intuitively know are there,
Right.
how they go. It's the details of it that I find are important for them to try to figure out. And I'll admit, I have Jupiter retrograde, I'm not always real. A lot of time I don't care.
Uh-huh.
I mean, not always.
Oh, I have Jupiter retrograde, and I love not caring. It's a wonderful feeling.
But I also know there's some things where it's like, okay, Ellie, you actually need to know the details of, you know what I mean, of this.
Right.
You actually need to know why you're saying what you're saying, why you're coming up with what you're coming up with.
Right.
And yeah, so yeah, I've really had to learn how to exercise that, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, if Jupiter retrograde can do that, it's usually pretty good. If
Yes.
they can, when they need to anyway.
Yes. Yeah. I've never heard that kind of take on it, and I think that's very insightful.
Yeah, that's kind of that's kind of how I've always thought of it. Oh, and another thing, Jupiter retrograde needs to come to their like, because I was talking about like noise with beliefs. They need to come to their beliefs, like they need to be from them. Now, obviously, that is going to come from other people and other religions, other beliefs, right? It is going to come from other things. But they need to kind of be able to put it together however feels right for them. That may,
right.
You know what I mean? That may not be adhering to a specific dogma. In fact, I'll be honest, I feel like dogma for Jupiter retrograde people probably isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that would be trying to tell somebody kind of what to believe or understand, and that would probably be a problem.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense too. I've struggled with belief systems.
Yeah.
Wondering what to believe. Really, there's things I've thought about for years before I've come to a clarity on what I really believe about that.
Yeah. And it's kind of a lifelong, even in some cases, a lifelong process.
Right. Exactly. So the outer planets then tend to be retrograde a lot more.
Yes. Pluto, for instance, is retrograde 6 months of the year.
So it's about half the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I gotta tell you a joke. This has to do. This is a double hitter where the Dalai Lama goes to get pizza and he's standing in line and he gets up to the order and the pizza guy says, "Well, what do you want?" And the Dalai Lama says, "Make me one with everything." And the guy said, "Okay, that'll be $17.60. So the Dalai Lama gives him a 20 and the guy says, "Next." And the Dalai Lama says, "What about my change?" And the guy says, "Change must come from within."
That's a pretty good one.
The point of that is the coming from within part with the retrograde.
Yes, yeah, and yes, absolutely. The power of the planet does really shine within, come from within. Yes.
Yeah. So internal Pluto can be so much about pressure. So internal pressure half the time sounds about right.
Yes, and Pluto retrograde, yes, internal pressure, lots of internal transformation, right? That the rest of the world may not see them go through, but they do inside.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, all those sorts of, and also power. The way that power is funneled tends to be more internal than external.
Right.
Which can be difficult in a world where, people kind of teach you to be powerful outwardly, right?
Exactly.
So that can be kind of that can have a tendency to make these people feel less powerful, which absolutely is not the fucking truth.
Right.
But,
Right.
Yeah. And the connection to to like the connection to the divine and like the return to the divine.
Yes.
It's another part of it.
Yeah, transformation, Pluto
yes.
transformation happening internally.
Yes.
So that you can connect with the divine.
Yes.
That really makes sense. Yeah.
We didn't talk about Mars though.
Well, I think Mars, I was just going to bring that up next. I think Mars must be the weirdest because Mars energy tends to always be thrusting outward, thrusting outward.
This, I don't have Mars retrograde, but this personally feels like it would be very frustrating. Or it could be, especially depending on what sign it fell in. It might be even more so.
Yeah, I don't have that either, and I'm very glad I don't.
Now, I do know that in my solar return this year, I think Mars is retrograde.
Uh-huh.
So I'm like, but watching that carefully.
Are you going to be adding a few, building a few new rooms internally?
It's possible. I also feel like it's going to be a little spastic. I don't know. It just feels kind of spastic to me. Like unconsciously spastic. So I'm kind of, it's going to be in Gemini and in the 12th house, and it just feels kind of, I don't know, a little unconsciously spastic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always associate Mars in 12th too with having impulse to do things, and maybe you don't know why, but you feel like doing it. You feel like doing it.
Yeah, and that's a little concerning too.
Yeah, right. Right. Because then when people say, Ellie, why did you do that? You go, I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm worried about, because I really do like to have reasons for why I do the shit that I do. And if I can't give you a reason, I feel kind of like an asshole.
Yeah, but in Gemini, you can come up with something probably.
I need to click on my feet.
Just make shit up,
Well, it is in the 12th house, so there could be some like illusionary shit going on. I probably could just make shit up if I wanted to.
Or stuff from past lives,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the retrograde motion of Mars turns all of that inward. So like the impulses, the person, I find that they tend to want to act, right? Like they want to act, they want to use Mars, but it can be very hard to do that.
Yeah.
Especially if it's not. I find Mars retrograde to be kind of similar to Mars in Virgo. Mars in Virgo, like if Mars in Virgo is not driven to do something like specific, they tend not to really care to do it.
Right.
And that, I know that's kind of a general.
I have Mars in Virgo, so I totally relate to that.
Okay. Well, I'm glad. I was going to say it's kind of a generalization that I'm making, but on average, it does seem that does happen with Mars in Virgo. And the same thing seems to be the case with retrograde Mars. The people kind of, if they aren't real driven to do it internally, they're not going to do it. And that seems to be kind of the case across all signs. Mars falling. I have noticed kind of an interesting thing where they are similar to Mars and Virgo in that way.
What just strikes me just off the wall, what would be really strange is Mars in Aries retrograde.
Oh, that one feels, you know what? It's funny. I have thought about this, okay? And I am not somebody who really gives a shit that much about exaltations and fall and detriment. Right. I really don't give that much of a shit about it. But
me neither.
To be totally honest. But I have thought about this before. If you did give a shit about this, right? Really, it seems like retrograde Mars would be in detriment in Aries. And perhaps retrograde Mars would be more at home in Libra.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like,
oh, yeah.
I haven't really played with this as terms of like exaltation and fall, but the domicile and the detriment placements, they do seem to fit. Like, okay, we'll take another one. Mercury retrograde. In Gemini, that can be very, very, very noisy, right?
Oh, yeah.
In Sagittarius, though, which does tend to be kind of like half on the ground, half in the clouds, that Mercury retrograde energy is kind of able to tap into that intuition more, if that makes sense.
Right, because it's about being internalized.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have done some thinking about, and it yeah. So I guess I'm saying, if anybody's watching this and they do give a shit about exaltation, fall, domicile, and detriment placements, definitely think about it. Think about the retrograde planet and it's as actually being at home in its detriment place and vice versa.
Yes. Yeah. That's good. That's interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, and Mars, another way that help, because I was talking about Mars and Virgo. Another way that it feels kind of Virgo-ish is I noticed that like Mars in Mars retrograde, there can tend to be, and this is again a generalization, not everybody's going to have this issue, but because Mars is so aggressive and because it is turned inward, right? That aggression, that assertion, it's turned inward. There can be a tendency for health issues to creep up.
Oh, yeah.
If there's not some kind of an outlet.
Yeah, like repressed anger or things like that.
Yeah.
Or just repressed sexuality or whatever.
Sex is another thing that can be a little different for these people. For sure, it can either be completely off, completely on,
right,
or they'll live their life kind of oscillating between the two.
Right, that makes sense.
It's not always super steady though. Yeah.
Now, do you ever look at like how fast the planet's moving? Like what I'm thinking is, say, with a Mars, with this is to be true with I think with any retrograde, but especially with Mars, maybe if that Mars is really close to a stationary, like it's retrograde, but it's like barely moving. It seems like that could really cause it to be stuck, kind of.
Yes, and I would think that, and you in this example, you said it was retrograde but stationary. I feel like that. Yeah, I would feel like that would even amplify the retrograde energy.
Yeah.
Which I think is what you mean by being stuck. But yes, I agree.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And then just a second, I'm going to pull this up. I want to look here just a minute at charts. What about Saturn retrograde?
Okay, Saturn. Okay, well, Saturn is, he direct anyway. And retrograde, but direct, we're talking about like authority. We're talking about mastery. We're talking about responsibility. We're also talking about, I love Saturn, but he can be limiting and restrictive too. Though I find sometimes when he limits and restricts, it's because you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we think of it as limiting, but really it's like he's saying, no, you don't need to do that shit anyway. So stop it. But,
right. Exactly.
But when, and also, there is something about Saturn, the status quo.
Yes.
There can't. When Saturn is retrograde, the notion that somebody has of what authority is, what mastery is, what responsibility is, even what limitations and boundaries are.
Right.
It definitely needs to become more personal, more internalized. It's probably not the same as what the rest of the world thinks of these things. Oftentimes, these people come into families, are born into families where they feel like they have to walk that line.
Yes.
Now, sometimes people that have Saturn retrograde, they'll have a parent that had Saturn retrograde. And if that parent is working with Saturn, if they've got it retrograde in their chart and they're functioning from the retrograde motion, they can be really, really great for that child, right?
Yes.
But oftentimes that's not the case. And they try to, pass down to their child, no, this is what you do. This is how you should be. You should respect authority, blah, 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 And the Saturn retrograde person really needs to figure out what all of those things mean for them. And it's probably different than what they have been raised to think.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking too, maybe another way of saying it is, like, so Saturn can rule blockages.
Yeah.
And so Saturn retrograde would be the need to deal with internal blockages.
Yes.
I think a lot of times when people have internal blockages, they don't know they're there. In other words, they've just become so accustomed to living with them that they're not aware that those internal blockages are there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's definitely something to for sure consider if you see Saturn retrograde in the chart, like by sign and house and everything. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes. So that's really interesting to think about. Now, of course, another thing that's retrograde very, very often, this is the nodes. Do you look at those too?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, the nodes, the way that the nodes move, the nodes are retrograde more often than they're not. They're the one thing that really are. I mean, like, you got the true node that'll bounce around from retrograde to direct, and then but it's retrograde more often than not. So when you do the mean node, if you mess with the mean node, that one will always be retrograde.
Exactly.
So yeah. Now, in terms of like what that actually means, I'll be honest, because it's always, when I see the nodes direct, I pay more attention to that in that case than I would if they're.
That makes sense because it's more rare.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so in that way it's a little flip, but I do definitely pay attention to that. Like if I'm doing like one of my past life and karmic readings and like where they wanted to go in the future this time around, if I notice that like there's actually recently I had a chart that had a bunch of retrograde planets.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think the nodes would be one of those things. Wasn't. Nodes were direct, and I was like, huh, now that's interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah.
So
yeah.
It yeah, definitely would take that into consideration.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about Uranus retrograde?
Uranus retrograde needs to be able to see like from a God's point of view. Omniscient, all-seeing, right? Needs to be able to do this. It needs to be able to detach to be able to do this. To individuate itself to be able to do this. Now, the thing about this that I've noticed is that, and it's one of two ways. The person is either too attached to themselves or like their own emotions that they can have a very hard time doing this, or they don't bring themselves into the equation enough when they see this omniscient point of view. Because in the omniscient point of view, you are part of that point of view. But I find that it often goes one of two ways, and it's usually pretty dramatic, if you will. Like it's very stark. It's either, over here, over here.
Mm-hmm.
How that actually ends up going depends on the whole chart. But there is usually some kind of detachment needed, whether that is more detachment from self.
Right.
Or some or enough detachment to be actually more attached to self, if you will, I guess, in that case, when the person actually needs to bring themselves into things.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But that's a big one for Uranus. That's something that, and trauma. Uranus is trauma. So I would think that there might be internal trauma, not actual physical trauma, but like internal, say, mental trauma, since Uranus is the higher octave Mercury. Internal, more internalized mental trauma that perhaps needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, need to find a way to clear that or release it or heal it. Yeah.
And internal, like fracturing.
Splitting off.
Yes, I have found that.
So often actual multiple personality disorder is based in trauma.
Yes.
And so the way they cope with the trauma is by fracturing.
They certainly could have Uranus retrograde. But even just like the internal fracturing that people do to like just handle daily trauma, just handle traumas that they've been through, without actually having multiple personalities as well. But yeah, there's a need to bring that together and heal too, right?
Are you, did I ask you this before? Are you at all into the Bach flower remedies?
You mentioned it. They sound really cool, but I don't know much about them.
Well, the one for Pisces is called Rock Rose, and it's for traumas.
Is it?
And as I've studied that and worked with that, I've come to the conclusion that, we're very aware of big, bold traumas that create stuff like multiple personality.
Yeah.
But I think people walk around with all sorts of subtle traumas that they never dealt with, that are kind of hidden, because what the world tends to tell us is, oh, just ignore that, go on. That's not important. That'll just get in your way. Just play like it's not there and just go on, And so that thing never gets healed because you're always just going on,
Yeah, I'm kind of the queen of that sometimes.
I can tell you're a very sensitive person.
I am. So I do have a tendency to do just what you're talking about, because sometimes I do it less now, but when I was younger, I did it a lot, like something would bother me. It's like, oh, shut up. Don't let that bother you. You know what I mean? Just.
Right.
It's
a way of coping.
It is. And it's like, I would compartmentalize things that happened. Right. And I would put them in a box. And I would say, okay, I'll deal with this later. And then later came and I never dealt with anything.
Exactly.
And then I'd add more fucking boxes.
Right.
But I don't do that so much anymore. Now when I put it away, I actually do try to deal with it. Because I know sometimes you can't deal with things right when they happen. Sometimes for whatever reason it is too painful, what have you, but it's the not dealing with it, just keeping them boxed.
Well, and I would imagine too, with all you've studied, that now you have all sorts of ways of dealing with these things. Like you have tools.
Yes.
For working with those things. Whereas maybe when you were younger, you didn't have so many tools.
Not the right ones.
Right.
Not the. Yeah. But definitely Uranus retrograde can function like that. And again, with Uranus retrograde, the God's point of view is what's important, right? Is what's happening. So that also means there not being like a compartmentalization of oneself too, like bringing that together, right? So that's important. That is important.
Yeah. One thing that people do that I find real kind of scary, kind of creepy, is they'll say to themselves, oh, wow, today I'm feeling really sad, but like, I don't have any reason to feel sad, so I must not feel sad. Oh, look, I can't feel sad because I don't have any reason to feel sad. And it's like, uh-oh, that's called repression.
That's called, you need to be getting out your tarot cards.
And like looking at why you're sad. And it could be that it's because of when your mother died in 3rd century BC Rome, that you never let go of or never dealt with.
So you carry it now. It's something.
Exactly.
The thing that you carry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Uranus then would help to. Uranus retrograde is asking you to work on your internal freedom.
Yes.
Yeah, that really makes sense.
Yes, I would. Yes, internal freedom, I think, is a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the only one we really haven't touched on is I'm working so hard to stay focused with my Mercury and Gemini. I just want to go every which way and ask you all different sorts of questions about all different sorts of things. But I'm staying on point pretty well, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, it's hard not to deviate off in the other. It's really hard.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes. So Neptune retrograde. That's kind of weird because Neptune tends to kind of want to be in there already, internal.
I find with this one, Well, there's definitely, like with Pluto retrograde, Neptune retrograde definitely wants to connect with source, with the divine. There is definitely a need to, because Neptune, there's no boundary, right? It lacks boundaries, so it's looking to dissolve those kinds of boundaries and connect with the divine, connect with source, or whatever terminology you're comfortable with. So having some sort of spiritual practice is very important for Neptune retrograde people. It doesn't have to be anything that anybody else knows about, or it's a very internal thing, right? It should be felt the most inside, but it's very, very important for them to have something that they do, connect themselves with source. Neptune can deal with, like, there can be spiritual trauma too. Neptune in general can correlate with this.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and the retrograde, maybe not in every single chart, but definitely spiritual trauma can play in here. Just like with Pluto, that can be like emotional trauma, right? So Neptune, the spirit, if there is any, if it looks like you're dealing with a chart of somebody who maybe does have some kind of spiritual trauma, and their Neptune is retrograde, that is going to be very, very internalized.
Right. Right.
And Neptune retrograde is one where, Neptune can be kind of foggy in general.
Oh, yeah. It's conjunct my moon. I live it on a daily basis.
Yeah, it can be a little, it's a little foggy. It's a little, it's imaginative. It's creative. It can also be delusional,
Right.
But when Neptune is retrograde, there tends to be more of an internal push to try to break through that stuff. That doesn't always mean that it happens, right? But there does seem to be some kind of an internal push for these people to kind of break through any kind of illusions or delusions or lies or conning themselves or what, this does seem to come into play for these people. And if you're somebody watching that has Neptune retrograde and you're like, no, I don't feel that, really sit and think about it. Sit and think about what it's doing in your chart. Because I'd say 9 times out of 10, you'll find that there is a push internally to break through. This, like I said, it may not always happen. It may not always be easy, but that push is there.
You're right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. And also, so Neptune could be self-delusion, deluding yourself.
Absolutely.
And so Neptune retrograde would be the desire to overcome that.
Yes.
Or to see the truth or the reality of the situation.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Now, again, that may not always be super easy to do, right? But that push, does tend to be there. It does. Like 9 times out of 10, it does tend to be there.
Yes. This internal delusion thing, I'm just thinking about someone I knew who told me she had this perfect childhood. Oh, my childhood was so perfect. It was so perfect. I kind of got tired of hearing that from her. Like, I thought, oh, why does she keep saying that? There's something weird going on here. And then she started talking about her father. So I started questioning her about her father one day. And she said, oh, my father was so good to me. He always showed me how I could improve anything. That I could improve this way and this that way. And I said, so what, did kind of everything need improving? And she said, oh, yes, everything always needed improving.
So he was critical.
And I said, yeah. So I said, so the message is you were totally imperfect. And that's your perfect childhood? This message from your father that you're totally imperfect? Expressed in this loving, nurturing way, it's like it was a deception. Just to be blunt, I think she was deceiving herself. It was not a perfect childhood.
Oh yeah, probably. Oh yeah, yeah. I'm sure she probably was. She probably was.
Yeah. So,
especially if she felt like she needed to keep telling you about how perfect it was.
Exactly. It's like, here, I'm sharing this fantasy with you.
Yeah.
Of my perfect childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find that people that do, like, even on social media, right? People that tend to post, and okay, I'm not ragging on anybody that posts, I love my husband posts, okay, or I love my wife posts. I'm not ragging on that. There are people that do this, that there's nothing going on under the surface. But I have found that a lot of times when people do that kind of shit, like excessive, I love my spouse posts, there's something seriously fucking wrong with the spouse.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
They're trying hard
yeah.
to convince themselves of something.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
No, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, who are you trying to get to believe this?
You're right. Exactly. Exactly. And of course, that's one of Neptune's maybe strategies. It can always try to make things look good by hiding it beneath something pretty, like a fog. You know?
Yeah. Like a fog, or, you know, getting creative with the way that it's bowed up, has a bow on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, one joke I would make about Neptune is, so I recently started going, like in the last couple of years, I started going to an optometrist.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, she said, you have a cataract in your left eye. And she says, she says, oh, and I said, oh, that's why I have I can't fully see clearly out of that eye. And she said, yeah. And she says, we can make that clear. She said, whenever you decide it's bothering you or whatever, she said, let me know, and we'll set you up an appointment and have it surgically removed, and then eyes will be clear. And my attitude is like, I don't know, I kind of like the fuzziness. It kind of makes everything a little prettier, you know, softer. When I look in the mirror, it softens my wrinkles, you know. So, you know, I think I could wait maybe a long time on that cataract. That's Neptune.
No, but you're right. It is. It's nicer to have things sometimes it could be nicer to have things a little less clear, because when things become clear, there's almost like it's like you're at the point of no return. There's no going back. You know what you know.
Right.
You know how it really is. There's no going back to that fuzziness anymore. You know.
Exactly.
Even if you want to, even if you yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That totally makes sense.
Chiron.
Yes. Oh yeah, Chiron.
And this is just this is just kind of the way that I read it. Retrograde, it's just very quick. When I see Chiron retrograde in a chart, regardless if it is tied to the nodal axis or Pluto and the Pluto polarity point or not, I usually always think of it as being part of the person's past life story.
My Chiron's retrograde. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what it's doing obviously it makes even more of packs more of a punch if it is attached to the nodes in some way, or Pluto or whatever. But regardless of what it's doing, if it's retrograde in a chart and I'm doing like a past life reading, I have definitely incorporated it in, you know, like, because to me it reads like, okay, so like you've got your wounding in this lifetime, right? Chiron is still your wounding in this lifetime. But when I see it retrograde, I think to myself, this is somebody whose wounding actually does stem from another time. It just came back around in this, but I guess the original wound never feels like it's from this time. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. That's interesting. I could tell. I don't want to take the time today, but I could tell you a couple of stories about that with me.
Do you feel like that?
Oh yeah, there was one lifetime I remember very vividly where I had a major wound. That was a physical wound that became a psychological wound.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that really, as I've released that over time, it's really helped me a lot to let go of that, to deal with that. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question too. Do you, when you look, do you ever look at the ninth harmonic?
I don't work with it that much.
Well, Well, because, the saying, maybe I told you this before, that the saying in Hindu type astrology is that the ninth harmonic is to the natal chart as the fruit is to the tree. So it's like where we're going.
I should probably look. I
Yeah.
should probably look at that more.
And then also in classical Indian astrology, the 12th harmonic is the past life.
They call it the 12th divisional, right? Is that what they?
Yeah.
The divisional charts. That's what they. Yeah.
Yeah. But like on your astrology program, your astrology program does harmonics?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you would just go calculate a 12th harmonic 12 for the chart and see what that looks like for you. You might look at that.
Yeah, I could check that out. That might be kind of cool. Yeah, because this kind of work, the past life and like where you're going, all of that is very. I mean, it's one of the things that I love doing the most. It
addresses the soul evolution.
Yeah.
So I love that sort of thing too. I think it's wonderful.
It hits the soul and it hits in a certain kind of way, and it's just like,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, one more thing about Chiron retrograde also, because it is retrograde, you'll also probably find that the wounding isn't always, it is more internal, right? It is more internalized. So the person may not, other people may not be as aware of it.
Right.
But it can feel very deep to the person. Very, very deep to the person.
Yeah, and sometimes when I talk to people about things that feel like are problems that I have, or fears I have, or just things like that, it's almost like I keep feeling like they don't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm really doing is I'm expressing a wounding that I have,
and they don't see it. They don't. Yeah. No.
Right.
I
right. Yeah. Which can be kind of frustrating.
It is frustrating. It's like, why the fuck am I saying anything at all?
Right. Right.
Uh-huh.
I guess, and it's most extreme. It's like me laying out something that's really like I'm grappling with, and a friend listening, and then they go, "Well, honey, I'm sure you'll be just fine."
Yeah, that's like.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I was looking for something a little more detailed than that, but okay.
Yes. Yeah. Getting some kind of shitty response like that. Yes. 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 And I think sometimes, and I think other Chiron retrograde people could probably relate to that.
Yes.
People just don't tend to see how deep whatever wounding or woundings, they don't tend to see how deep they go.
Right. Exactly. Yes. That totally makes sense. Well, this has been great. Yeah. And maybe we could do it again another time.
I'd love to. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. No, thank you for doing this. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, I did too. So this is John Sandbach. You can visit my website at johnsandbach.net. And what's your website, Ellie?
My website is www.saturnseason.com. I'm also on Instagram at Saturn Season Astrology. I'm on YouTube with, the channel is called Let's F with Astrology. YouTube wouldn't circulate the channel around having the word fuck in there, so I had to change it. And on the subreddit, Let's Fuck with Astrology, that's spelled out. Okay,
great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, you have a nice evening.
You too. I'll talk to you later.